Around July 19, 2021, I posted a video on how to read Rick Riordan's books to help new readers get into the Riordanverse and understand the books better. This video was from like 3 years ago, and ever since, Rick Riordan has published book after book and is still making new ones as I make this video. With these new books releasing almost every year, one concern that was prominent among fans, and that was how insane the Riordanverse timeline is becoming. There's a lot of books in this vast universe Rick created, and it begs the question if everything still adds up until now. As a Riordanverse reader for many years now, I can still understand where Rick currently is in this crazy timeline he created, but a lot of fans, especially new readers, are lost as to where they should start or what is happening with the timeline in general. With this, I decided to make this video to help those who want to understand the Riordanverse timeline and how to get into the books. Before getting into it though, I just want to say that I'll be discussing the timeline first to help you guys understand events that happen chronologically and not necessarily how to read them yet. I'll discuss how to fully read everything after the timeline. I just want you guys to understand that to avoid confusion. Another thing I want to say before starting is that the Riordanverse may seem intimidating with the amount of books you could read, but there's actually just 5 main series. First is the 5 Percy Jackson and the Olympian books, or commonly known as the PJO books, which are The Lightning Thief, The Sea of Monsters, The Titan's Curse, The Battle of the Labyrinth, and The Last Olympian. The series that takes place after PJO is The Heroes of Olympus, another 5-book series that has the following: The Lost Hero, The Son of Neptune, The Mark of Athena, The House of Hades, and The Blood of Olympus. The next main series is The Trials of Apollo, a 5-book series that takes place after The Heroes of Olympus. The Trials of Apollo has the following books: The Hidden Oracle, The Dark Prophecy, The Burning Maze, The Tyrant's Tomb, and The Tower of Nero. The last 2 main series in the Riordanverse aren't that related to PJO, Heroes of Olympus, or The Trials of Apollo, but they are considered a part of the main heart of the Riordanverse too. These are the King Chronicles, an Egyptian-based trilogy that has the following books: The Red Pyramid, The Throne of Fire, and The Serpent's Shadow. The last main Riordanverse series is Magnus Chase, another trilogy, and this time it tackles Norse mythology with these books: The Sword of Summer, The Hammer of Thor, and The Ship of the Dead. The rest of the books that Rick has published after these are considered side books, novellas, and companion books that take place in between some series or books. So let's go over the Riordanverse timeline and arrange the books with their chronological order. Get ready, because this will be quite the roller coaster ride. The first book that takes place chronologically isn't even in the main series. It's a companion book for the Heroes of Olympus called The Demigod Diaries. The Demigod Diaries is a compilation of short stories of different characters, and the first ever story happens in this book through the story The Diary of Luke Castellan. The next book chronologically is The Lightning Thief, the first book of the 5 Percy Jackson and the Olympian books. From there, it's a bit easy to navigate as you just follow the next book of The Sea of Monsters and then The Titan's Curse. However, you gotta stop for a bit after The Titan's Curse because Rick published a companion book for PJO called The Demigod Files. It's kind of like The Demigod Diaries, as it's also a book filled with short stories of different characters. In The Demigod Files, the short story Percy Jackson and the Stolen Chariot takes place after the events of The Titan's Curse. From this, it moves to the Battle of the Labyrinth, and then it goes to 2 short stories from The Demigod Files again. The first being Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades, and then Percy Jackson and the Bronze Dragon. After these, I'm going to drop a bombshell on you guys. If you were focused on Percy's world for the past books, well, Rick is going to make you care about other characters in a completely different setting through the King Chronicles. Before, I was so confused as to where the King Chronicles would take place, but after some research, I realized that the first book, or the Red Pyramid, takes place after these short stories. Directly after the Red Pyramid is its next book, or the Throne of Fire, and then it goes to The Last Olympian, or the last book of the main PJO series. So, before continuing, let's try to visualize everything so far. First is The Demigod Diaries, The Diary of Luke Castellan, The Lightning Thief, The Sea of Monsters, The Titan's Curse, The Demigod Files, Percy Jackson and the Stolen Chariot, The Battle of the Labyrinth, The Demigod Files, Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades, The Demigod Files, Percy Jackson and the Bronze Dragon, The Red Pyramid, The Throne of Fire, and then is The Last Olympian. And now, let's go to the events after The Last Olympian. After this book, another short story takes place, and it's from the Demigod Diaries. Remember the Demigod Diaries? It's the companion book for the Heroes of Olympus that I mentioned earlier, and the short story The Staff of Hermes takes place after The Last Olympian. Next up, we have a short story from a book called Guys Read Other Worlds. This one isn't even categorized as a Percy Jackson book. Like, Rick collaborated with other authors for a story titled Percy Jackson and the Singer of Apollo, but it's still technically a part of the timeline. Around the same time, the King Chronicles trilogy would wrap up with the final book, The Serpent's Shadow. And then, we jump into The Lost Hero, which is the first book of the Heroes of Olympus series. From this point, we'll have to go back to the companion book, The Demigod Diaries, because a short story called Leo Valdez and the Quest for Buford takes place around this time. From here, it's a smooth ride through the Heroes of Olympus. The Son of Neptune, the Mark of Athena, the House of Hades, and finally, the Blood of Olympus. So again, let's recap here. After The Last Olympian, here's the books or stories that takes place. The Demigod Diaries, The Staff of Hermes, Percy Jackson and the Singer of Apollo, The King Chronicles Book 3, The Serpent's Shadow, and then we go to the first book of the Heroes of Olympus, or The Lost Hero, before going back again to the Demigod Diaries through Leo Valdez and the Quest for Buford. From here, we can go to the books in order for the Heroes of Olympus. The Son of Neptune, the Mark of Athena, the House of Hades, and the Blood of Olympus. So let's breathe a bit, because if you think this is getting crazy, well, get ready because things are about to get crazier. After the Blood of Olympus, the Demigods and Magicians side story takes place. This is basically a King Chronicles and PJO collaboration, and it happens like this. Demigods and Magicians, the Son of Sebek, Demigods and Magicians, the Staff of Serapis, and Demigods and Magicians, the Crown of Ptolemy. Next up, brace yourselves, because we're entering the Chalice of Gods trilogy. This new series takes place a few months after the Blood of Olympus, but we can't assume that it comes after the Demigods and Magicians stories, just to keep things a little bit clearer. The first book, The Chalice of Gods, is just the beginning, and the second book, The Wrath of the Triple Goddess, just dropped this September. A third book is on the way, possibly in the next years, but we don't have a title for that yet, so let's just call it unnamed for now. So after the Chalice of Gods trilogy, we finally go to two of the main 5 series that I mentioned earlier. Believe it or not, but Magnus Chase's The First Book, or The Sword of Summer, takes place at the same time as The Hidden Oracle. The Magnus Chase books are interconnected with the Trials of Apollo books deeply through subtle references on both ends, and let's continue with that note. After the Hidden Oracle and the Sword of Summer, we have the Dark Prophecy, or the second book in the Trials of Apollo, and the Hammer of Thor, the second book in Magnus Chase. Both of these take place simultaneously, much like the previous pair. Now after this, we sort of disconnect from Magnus Chase. The Trials of Apollo continues to the Burning Maze and then the Tyrant's Tomb, but both Magnus Chase and the Trials of Apollo connect again afterwards. After the Tyrant's Tomb, both the Trials of Apollo's The Tower of Nero and Magnus Chase's The Ship of the Dead take place at the same time. And then we go to the most recent Riordanverse book timeline-wise. The Sun and the Star, or the Nico D'Angelo and Will Solis novella that I made a book review of, so if you're interested, it's linked down below. Even though The Sun and the Star is the most recent chronologically, an Italian story written by Rick Riordan says otherwise. I'm not really Italian, so I won't attempt to pronounce the title anymore, but it's so obscure that I didn't even know it existed. This story was posted on Rick's website during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it takes place during that time for Percy and the gang. So, technically speaking, this is the most recent Riordanverse story, but I can't find that much info on it. Canonically though, The Sun and the Star is still the most recent timeline-wise, unless you want to consider this pandemic-based one. And that's the Riordanverse timeline. I know that for some experienced and well-versed Riordanverse fans, you guys might mention that I didn't include some guidebooks like Percy Jackson Greek Gods, or 9 from the 9 Worlds, or Camp Haplet Confidential, or even Camp Jupiter Classified, a Probation's Journal, but I think these books don't need to take place chronologically as they're guides. You can generally read them anytime if you feel like it. Anyway, let's summarize the order of the books and stories that I mentioned in this timeline. First is the Demigod Diaries, the Diary of Luke Castellan, The Lightning Thief, The Sea of Monsters, The Titan's Curse, The Demigod Files, Percy Jackson and the Stolen Chariot, The Battle of the Labyrinth, Percy Jackson and the Sword of Hades, Percy Jackson and the Bronze Dragon, The Red Pyramid, The Throne of Fire, and then it's The Last Olympian. After The Last Olympian are the following books: The Demigod Diaries, The Staff of Hermes, Percy Jackson and the Singer of Apollo, The Serpent's Shadow, The Lost Hero, The Demigod Diaries, Leo Valdez and the Quest for Buford, The Son of Neptune, The Mark of Athena, The House of Hades, and The Blood of Olympus. The books after The Blood of Olympus are the Demigods and Magicians side stories, like The Son of Sebek, The Staff of Seriphus, The Crown of Ptolemy. And then it's the Chalice of Gods trilogy, which are The Chalice of Gods, The Wrath of the Triplet Goddess, and an unnamed third book. And then we should head over to the connection that Magnus Chase and the Trials of Apollo have through both the Sword of Summer and the Hidden Oracle. And then it's the Dark Prophecy and the Hammer of Thor, the Burning Maze, and the Tyrant's Tomb. After this, Magnus Chase and the Trials of Apollo connect again through the Ship of the Dead and the Tower of Nero. And lastly, the newest and most recent book timeline-wise is The Sun and the Star, or That Italian Story. With all this information on the timeline, let's take a moment to breathe. And here's how I'd suggest you tackle these books. First, jump right into the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. Start with The Lightning Thief and read all the way through to The Last Olympian. After that, you can check out any story you want in the Demigod Files. Next, it's optional whether you want to read Percy Jackson and the Singer of Apollo. Personally, I never read it because it didn't seem to fit neatly into the timeline, but I've heard that Percy references it in the Chalice of Gods, so it might be worth a look if you want. After that, I recommend diving into the Demigod Diaries, and then moving on to the King Chronicles. I'd suggest you finish the entire King Chronicles trilogy before starting the Heroes of Olympus. Once you're done with the Heroes of Olympus, you can read the Demigods and Magicians miniseries. They're pretty cool to check out if you want to see more of the King Chronicles, and it has some nice scenes. From there, you can read the Chalice of Gods, and then the Wrath of the Triplet Goddess. After that, you have to make a choice between Magnus Chase or the Trials of Apollo. Personally, I'd recommend tackling the Magnus Chase trilogy first because it's just 3 books, and once you finish that, you can move on to the Trials of Apollo. After the Trials of Apollo, you can finally read The Sun and the Star, as The Sun and the Star takes place immediately after Trials of Apollo's last book, or The Tower of Nero. Finally, you're free to go with the Riordanverse guidebooks that I mentioned earlier, like Percy Jackson Greek Gods, 9 from the 9 Worlds, Brooklyn House Magician's Manual, Camp Half-Blood Confidential, Camp Jupiter Confidential, A Probatio's Journal, Hotel Valhalla Guide to the Norse World, The Cursed Carnival and Other Calamities, new stories about mythic heroes, and even That Italian Story. Overall, that's the Riordanverse. It's a huge universe that Rick Riordan created through his books, and over the years, it's been pretty complicated to navigate. I hope that through this video, you guys were able to understand it a little bit more and get into the books that I've grown to love. So, how about you? What do you think of the Riordanverse timeline? Let me know in the comments down below.